And the preaching team, in their wisdom and in my absence, decided to allocate me a chapter that contains genealogy, a curse, dead animals, and to lighten the mood, we've got a rainbow. So this is a chapter towards the end of our preaching series, and I guess they thought there is a lot of content in this chapter, so I thought, they would think that you'd be gracious enough to sit there and listen to a longer sermon from me, because it's my first time being with you. So today we move on to chapter 9 as part of our Genesis series, and I will be preaching a longer sermon this morning than I usually do. There are some things that I want to set up, and the sermon also provides a segue into our communion table that we have this morning. But I promise you there'll still be time for a cuppa, and you'll still all be home in time for lunch. Is that okay? Okay. You now know that Genesis means beginnings. Cam told you that in Genesis 1 part 1 that the beginning refers to God's active time on earth within the context of eternity. We also know that Genesis is part of the Pentateuch, the Torah, or the books of the law. And the book of Genesis really tells the story of how Israel became God's special people. As such, Genesis was written in the original Hebrew language. In Genesis chapter 1:1 to 2:25, you looked at the creation account of the universe, the earth, and man. In Genesis 1 verse 2, we see the Spirit of God hovering above the universe. The Ruach breath of God, as Matt put it. In Genesis 1 verse 6, you will have seen on the second day, God said, "Let there be an expanse," or a vault, as Camp said, between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse, or the vault, and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And what we actually see here is God creating a firmament to separate the water, so that in fact we have two bodies of water, one body above the sky and one body below the sky. And on the following day, the third day, then God created the seas from the body of water that was below the sky. And still today there is a firmament holding back the waters above the sky. In Genesis 1:27, you learned or reaffirmed your knowledge that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The word teslem is a noun meaning image in the Hebrew. It also means form and likeness. And the word demut in Hebrew is also a noun meaning figure, image, likeness, form, or shape. And both these words first appear in the Hebrew in Genesis 1 verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." And he goes on in the remainder of the verse to give them rule. Genesis 5:1 tells us this is the written account of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them, male and female, and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them man. That's why it's easy for each of us to speak of having a spirit man. Our body, the vessel that we are in, whether that be male or female, it's just the vessel that carries the spirit man that's inside us. You might recall Matt in Genesis part 3 sermon told you that natural man Adam needed a natural woman, a wife, and that spirit man also needs a spiritual helper because we're called to walk by the Spirit. I'd like to add to that and say that the spirit man is the part of us that enables us to operate in the likeness of God. our physical bodies are also in the likeness of God's Son, Jesus, in many ways, subsequently also aligning us with the image of God, though Jesus alone, of course, is divine in this regard. So in Genesis 1:27 and 5:1 clearly indicate God has both image and form. And there are many clear examples in the Hebrew language of people who experienced God in visible form. We know Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, verses 8-21 did. Jacob in Genesis 32:24 to 29 and verse 30 did. For Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. In Exodus 24, verses 9 to 11, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders in Israel all went up and saw the God of the Israelites. And God did not raise his hand against the Israelite leaders. They saw God, they ate and drank. So clearly, God has image and form. And ultimately, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you'll understand that this is explained in Colossians 1 verse 15, where Paul speaks of the supremacy of Christ. And he says, he is the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created. Later in the verse, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth, things in heaven, by making peace through the blood shed on the cross. In verse 28, we see God blessing his creation and saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. And then God goes on in verse 29 to give the man and woman rule over every living creature, and to give them every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it for food. The Hebrew word for rule here is vayadu, and it means let them rule over it, and it refers to both men and women having rule. You'll remember that Cam shared with you in Genesis part 4 sermon that Adam and Eve are equal in priesthood. After that, you moved on to consider the fall of the man and the result of sin in chapters 3:1 to 5 verse 32. And regarding sin, I'd just like to make one further point today before I move on. In the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 letters, and each letter is assigned a numerical value. It's called its gematria value. The original Hebrew alphabet was also pictographic, and each letter represented a picture in its own meaning. And still today, many Israeli people use this to understand the deeper meanings behind a word or phrase. The Hebrew word for sin or misdemeanor is chet, and the word has 3 letters. The het is worth 8 in gematria value, the tet is worth 9, and the aleph is worth 1. That gives us a total gematria value of 18 for that word. We see this kind of sin when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Remember, Cam told you in Genesis part 4 sermon that it was this act that caused the priesthood to lose its holiness. Let's look at another example. In Genesis 3 verse 9, God calls to Adam, asking him where he is. And we see Adam's response in this preceding verse where he hid from God among the trees in the garden. We hear his response in verse 10 when Adam says, I hid. And the Hebrew word for I hid myself, va'eshavi, also has a gematria value of 18. For this word, the vav is 6, aleph 1, het 8, bet 2, and the aleph is 1. So we have a total of 18. And we see this sin again in chapter 4 with Cain and Abel. And Peter Telford shared on this. We see it in chapter 6:11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God had seen how corrupt the earth had become, for all people on earth had corrupted their ways. The people God had created were getting further from him because of their sin. And Peter also shared this in his Genesis Part 5 sermon. It's important to understand that Hebrew people find a connection between words and phrases that have the same gematria value. So here we see both sin and I hide myself as having the same gematria value. Remember, they were both 18. So in Hebrew thought, it is very clear that when we sin, we also try to hide ourselves. And the Latin phrase used by Augustine of Hippo and Martin Luther, sin incurvatus in se, also means man is curved in on himself. And this denotes a similar picture of sin turning people inwards instead of towards God. One group who did turn inwards and didn't try and hide themselves were the Nephilim. In Genesis 6:1, you began looking at the story of Noah. And in Genesis 6:4, preceding the flood, you heard from Ian in his Genesis Part 4 sermon that the Nephilim were already on the earth. For this verse tells us the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Ian explained this, and I'd also like to add one further point today. What this passage doesn't do well is explain the Hebrew meaning behind it, because the original Hebrew was later transferred to Greek. And that word, gigantus, which translates giants in English, actually really distorts the original Hebrew meaning of the verse. In the Hebrew, Nephilim translates ha-Nephilim, and this is a plural masculine word meaning fallen ones. So according to the original language, these were supernatural fallen angels, to be precise. And these fallen ones later went on to procreate with the daughters of men and had children to them. As we heard Ian share, there was also much wickedness on the earth by that time. And bullies, as Ian explained, were throughout the earth. At this, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of his thoughts of all of his heart was only evil all the time. And so the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I've created, from the face of the earth. And he goes on, for I am grieved that I have made them. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Chapter 7 and 8 provided you with information on the flood that God brought upon the earth because of man's wickedness. And they also share how he instructed Noah to build an ark and saved him and his children because he was found righteous before God in his time. And Chris shared with you in his Genesis Part 7 sermon that there was a man of righteousness that saved humanity, and his name was Noah. He also shared that the story of Noah is a preamble to the story of Jesus Christ, and our salvation is through him. We now know that together, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives all entered the ark. And 1 year and 10 days later, they all came out of the ark, because Genesis 18 tells us Noah came out together with his sons and his wives and his sons' wives. And that brings us to chapter 9, where we'll pick up today. So we're all good to launch in? Chapter 9 can be divided into 3 different sections. In verses 1 to 7, there's a bookend conversation that that God has with Noah and his sons. Verses 8 to 17 relate to a covenant that God makes with Noah and his sons. And verses 18 to 27 are concerned with the sons of Noah and the curse of Canaan. The final verse of the chapter tells us that after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. So altogether, Noah lived 950 years and then he died. Let's deal with verse 1 and 7, the bookends first, because it seems like a logical place to start. And both of these verses are virtually identical. They're a point that God does not want his people to miss. Verse 1, then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Verse 7 reads, as for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Twice here we see God making this statement, so he thereby confirms this blessing and his instructions to Noah and his sons. And in actual fact, we know that before the flood, in Genesis 1 verse 28, Cam shared with us that God provided this same blessing to man and female when he created them. He gave them the same instruction. Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. And prophetically speaking, when God says something 3 times, it means that it's already been established in the spiritual realm and that we just need to pull it down to make it manifest in the natural. So we can see very clearly here then that it is God's plan that man be fruitful, increase in number and fill the earth. God said this when he first created man, and now again after destroying humanity with the exclusion of righteous Noah and his family, he reiterates his same plan again. Please note here, the plans of God do not change. It is man who has failed God. You remember Peter Telford in his Genesis Part 5 sermon spoke of the multiplication of separation from God because of man's sins when he was sharing about Cain. However, we see here, despite man's failings, God in his great love and mercy is still proceeding with his original plan. And I'd like to take a quick look now how this has unfolded to date. And to do this, we need to know, of course, who Noah's sons are. In Genesis 5:32, you will have heard that Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis 9:18 also tells us the sons of Noah who came out of the ark with him were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. So we know they all survived their time on the ark. These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. The Bible traces the descendants of Shem to a number of different regions, including the Elamites, which is modern Iran today, and the land of the Armenians and the Asherites, which is modern Iraq and Assyria, these Middle Eastern peoples. And these people were blessed by God to be fruitful and increase in number, and they still are. Genesis 11 verse 10 tells us that Shem was 100 years old at the birth of Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood, and he lived for another 500 years after that. So Shem survived for 600 years, and he had a total of 5 children, including Arpachshad. And from Arpachshad we get Salah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abram, or Abraham, who married Sarah, Nahor, and Haran. And there's some conjecture in the Bible about which of Noah's sons was the youngest. However, we can turn to a Jewish text, the book of Jubilees, to discover that Ham was born 2 years after Shem and 3 years before his brother Japheth. And according to what's known as the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, Ham was the father of 4 children, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, who was cursed. And in a number of the Psalms and in 1 Chronicles 4, verse 40, Egypt is referred to as the land of Ham. And we know that Egypt is located in northern Africa. However, it was not the land of Ham's son Canaan, who settled in Phoenicia, or modern-day Lebanon instead. And by making this choice, Canaan settled on the land that was not his inheritance, or in those days, the land that his family had not received by lot. The land that he chose to settle in was actually Shem's inheritance. And so by making this choice, Canaan brought a curse upon himself and his family for the generations to come. Shem's inheritance, the land Canaan settled on, was actually the land that was later promised to Abraham. And so we can see right back in the beginning, the land that was promised to Shem and ultimately promised to Abraham and is still part of the land promised to Israel today, was fraught with curses regarding those who were not rightful owners trying to settle there. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, which is our third section today, Noah also said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." Noah goes on in verses 26 and 27 to say, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." Now, Shem was blessed, and the Lord was his God. From Shem, we got Abram, and importantly, this is the lineage of the Israelites, including Jesus, who was a Jew. Noah goes on, "And may God extend the territory of your pet. May your pet live in the tents of Shem." And your pet has indeed spread out across the earth, and we'll hear more about that shortly. Finally, Noah continues, "And may Canaan be his slave." Now, all this occurred because Noah planted a vineyard, got drunk, and ended up naked in his tent. You might recall Chris told you that Noah got drunk even though he was righteous because he was under the sin of Adam. We continue. "To whom Canaan was his fourth-born son." So Ham was Canaan's fourth-born son. And he told his other brothers, Shem and Yepet, about this. And Shem and Yepet protected Noah's dignity when they went into the tent and they covered over him without looking upon him naked. But in the Hebrew thought, Noah deemed this could have cost him the act of having potentially a fourth son. Hence, the curse targets Ham's fourth-born son, Canaan. So the Bible tells us Canaan was cursed and is destined to be a slave. Interestingly, from Canaan, we get Sidon, Heth, the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinanites, Arabites, Zemarites, Hamathatites, probably any other rites you can think of. And after that, they spread abroad. Genesis 10:19 tells us that the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon towards Gerar, as far as Gaza, then towards Sodom and Gomorrah, Adam and Zeboim as far as Lasha. Now, we don't have time to consider the legacy that each of these cursed people groups have left us today, but I will briefly look on one, Sidon, because genealogy can contain important messages. And there's one here that I believe is pertinent for the church today. Sidon's the third largest city in Lebanon. It's located on the Mediterranean coast. It's got a population of about 80,000 people today. And close by to there, we find Tyre and also the city of Beirut. And that entire region has about 250,000 people today. So indeed, these people have multiplied. When we consider the 12 tribes, the tribe of Zebulun borders Sidon, and Tyre actually sits within the tribe of Asher, though they never conquered it. And so for a long time, the Sidonians have oppressed the land of Israel. Now, in the Bible, we come to know that Solomon married a Sidonian woman. And this is how idolatry found its way into Israel. The one true God, of course, would not be happy with this at all. And we learn of this as the story unfolds. Interestingly, Jezebel was the daughter of King Ethelbal I of Sidon. And so here we see Jezebel being introduced into the land promised to God's people. If you think back to the land that Canaan acquired by Lot, this was not the land that he was supposed to be in the first place. So Jezebel was never supposed to be in the promised land at all. And this is a point for the church to remember in our times too. With Jezebel comes the curse. In the Old Testament, we see the prophet Elijah travelled through Sidon, performing many miracles in an attempt to turn the people back to the true God. Such is God's great mercy. And in the New Testament, we also see Jesus reaching out to the region of Tyre and Sidon, preaching the word of God to them. You might remember that he performed an exorcism miracle on a Canaanite woman's daughter who was severely demon-possessed. And so from this example, we can conclude that it is Jesus' will that we would reach out to those who have taken the promised land from God's people, to share the gospel with them, and to be rid of anything that would set itself up in opposition to God, so that they would be one for him. Let's continue to move on to Noah's third son. Sorry, folks. We apologise for this break in transmission. As soon as the problem has been rectified, we will return you to our normal program. For those of you old enough to remember that one. The third son of Noah, who was blessed of God to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, was Japheth. Now, Japheth's an ancestor of the European people, the people of Greece, of Anatolia, who were a group of Indo-Europeans at that time, and of Caucasus group, who were a diverse group made up of about 50 different languages during that time. Also, the largest continental areas on Earth being Europe and all Asia. Some 93 countries today, with a combined population of about 5.6 billion people. Now, this fruitfulness is because Japheth had 8 children, including Gomer, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Tiras, some of whom will become very important in the Ezekiel 38-39 war and in the book of the Revelation. This end times war is an important biblical marker for us as Christians today, as it's by this that we can better hope to know the times. Japheth's regarded as the ancestor of the Gog and Magog tribes, and this tends to include the Turks, which includes 65 million in Turkey, almost 32 million in Uzbekistan, 20 million in Iran, 12 million in Russia, about 13.5 million in China, and so many more. It also includes southern eastern Russia, southern Ukraine, and western Kazakhstan, and the list goes on. So indeed, from Adam and Eve, and subsequently from these 4 men in Genesis chapter 9, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, we can see God's sovereignty and the fruit of his instruction to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. These men did just that. And we currently have approximately 8.2 billion people in the world today that have come through the line of Adam and Eve and these 4 men. I would say that that is blessing in abundance, far beyond what any of these 4 men could have ever imagined. So it is with God's plans. Let me put this another way. If God gave you 4 sheep, or he gave you 4 cows, and you look back in years to come, and from those 4, you had 8.2 billion sheep or cows, would you not have been blessed? Or if he gave you 4 sons, and from those 4 sons, years down the track, you could look back and you had 8.2 billion grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, would you not have considered that they were fruitful, abundant, and they had been blessed? He truly is a God of abundance and blessing. And the blessing has not stopped. There are more children being born every second of the day throughout the world. Look at his plan coming to pass regarding this matter. Literally, could we have the world odometer, please? Literally before our very eyes as we speak. Look at all those births being added on and the population increasing right now. His purposes and plans prevail. Let's move on. Similarly, as in Genesis chapter 7, can you keep that up please for now? In Genesis chapter 7, we now see in Genesis chapter 9, God giving the four men everything that lives and moves in addition to all the green plants. So again, here we see God reestablish his plan for humanity to rule over everything. It seems that our God found this one righteous man to stand in the gap for all mankind, and he did it. He actually did achieve God's purpose. First, God did it with Adam, and now he's done it again with Noah. And this further points us forward to the time of Jesus, who will be the one man who stands in the gap for all humanity later in the story, as all of our Genesis series speakers have shared with you. Let's continue on with our first section. Now with the blessing, the instruction, and the provision in Genesis 9 verse 1-3 considered, then comes the guidelines that God provides between the two bookends. You can remove that one now, thank you. Thanks. Verse 4, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. 5, and for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an account from every animal and from each man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God, God has made man. And I'll touch just briefly on this because we've still got much to cover. The Hebrew word for man is ha-adam, meaning the man. And Adamah also means earth, soil, or ground. Both these words share the same gematria value. So we know now that we can tie them together. So we get the word man comes from the soil, earth, or ground. From this word, we also get the word adumah from the singular feminine, and it means red. And another word too, Adam, which means man, person, or human. All this we can see in the Hebrew word ha-adam. And there's another meaning too for this word, Adam. In the Hebrew, words can have multiple meanings. Adam also means vapor, fume, steam, or mist. And here I would like to highlight the facts that God formed man from the dust, as Cam shared, and he breathed his ruach breath, or vapor, into man also. In addition, 55 to 60% of our body is made up of water, depending upon whether we are male or female and due to difference of body fat and tissue. Secondly, from the word ha-adam, the man, we also get the word dam, which is a noun in Hebrew meaning blood, life, or existence. And we see this testified to in Leviticus 17, verse 11. For the life of a creature is in its blood. As would also be obvious, creation's blood also happens to be red, adumah. What these verses between the bookends are effectively saying then is the man who was from the soil, earth, or ground is created in the image of God. He has the life-giving breath of God, water, and red blood in him. He has great value and worth, as does every living creature who also has life, my lifeblood, and the image of my existence in them. Do no harm to them, or you'll be called to account. This is followed by the bookend verse that we covered earlier. So God blesses them, instructs them, gives them this guideline to remember as they do go out and increase and fill the earth. And then he blesses them and gives them that same instruction again. And we saw God provide that instruction in Genesis 1:28 to Adam and Eve, Emkochai, the mother of all living. And again, a second time in Genesis verse 1, where he confirms his plan. And now again, we see him demonstrate his plan and is established once and for all when he shares it a third time in Genesis 9, verse 7. Now, having reaffirmed his plan for humanity with Noah and his sons, God then goes on in Genesis 9:8 to establish his covenant with them and their descendants that will come after them, and with every living creature that was with them when they came out of the ark, every living creature on earth. He does this before they can depart on their mission. And this covenant plays out in verses 9 to 17, which is our second section we're covering today. We've already covered our third section, the curse of Canaan. However, before we go on to look at covenant, I do want to remind you of the fact that a covenant is a solemn binding agreement, which defines the terms of relationships between two parties. In the case of the Holy Bible, the Hebrew word for covenant is berith, and it means binding agreement, pact, or treaty. And the parties which enter into this are God and his people. The root word for berith is linked to the Hebrew word karat, which is cutting. And this is because in Hebrew culture, as Ian touched on in his Genesis Part 6 sermon, covenants were most often made binding in nature and sealed by passing between cut pieces of dead animal, otherwise known as an animal sacrifice. The two parties would pass through these pieces, symbolising their commitment to the covenant that they were making. And if they failed to uphold that binding agreement, they were effectively giving the other party permission to do to them what had been done to that animal, to cut them down or basically destroy their life. Speaking of life that had become corrupted, that particular covenant that we're going to look at today also points us back to the Edenic or the Adamic covenant before the flood. Because as you may recall, God made a covenant with Adam in the Garden of Eden, which was located in Mesopotamia, in the region of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. God's original covenant was made with Adam before the fall, and it involved an instruction not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You might recall Cam said, the tree in the middle of the garden is a reminder not to play God. We know that Adam and Eve did break the terms of that agreement. And so there were consequences that God instigated once the covenant was broken by their wrong actions. You will have already heard that is from this covenant, broken covenant, that women get pains in childbirth, or as Cam shared, increased pain across the whole childbearing journey. And further, that men must work for a living. That original covenant was broken. And now that God's re-established and blessed humanity again, God wants to demonstrate to humanity that he is still faithful and he's still committed to his people. And so he makes this second covenant with his people that he saved from the flood. And Peter Telford referred to this when he said, God's covenant restores separation. In Genesis 9:12, God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." So God shares with these four men, through whom all humanity will be realised, what the sign of the covenant is. The sign, of course, is the rainbow in the clouds. He shares who the covenant is between. The covenant is it's initiated, firstly, by God alone. Man has nothing to do with this. This covenant is initiated by God alone. It is for man, for every living creature, and for God. He is holding himself accountable to this covenant. And he also shares how long the covenant will last. It's an eternal covenant for all generations to come. So as a curious person, I want to ask, if a rainbow is the forever covenant, what actually is a rainbow? And for the scientists among you, a Google search from the Royal Meteorological Society, Canon Global, and also Physics Classroom teaches us that a rainbow occurs when the light radiating from the sun comes into contact with water droplets in the atmosphere. When sunlight first enters a droplet, it slows down and it bends away from its original path, a process called refraction. And the result is that it splits this white light that we normally see into all 7 different colours that make up white light. The light then bounces off of the inner surface of the water droplet, and as it exits, the droplet bends that again. And scientists say that each colour we see has a different wavelength. There's approximately only 2 degrees of separation between the red light we see and the blue light we see in their wavelengths. And apparently the red refractive index of water is 1.32, and violet has the shortest wavelength, and that's 1.34. And all of the other colours fit somewhere between those two. It's very precise. These refractive differences apparently cause the sun to bend this light at slightly different angles. And we see that red light is bent out of the droplet at a steeper angle to the ground than we see blue light. The red bends the least, which means it's always at the top of the rainbow. I have checked this out since I've researched this, and this is the case. That leaves the blue light at the bottom because violet bends the most. So as the white light is separated into 7 different colours, it's dispersed. And because the water's refracted from the water droplet or bent a second time as it exits the drop, it actually spreads the colours out even further. So what we see is this entire spectrum of colours that made up of a host of tiny water droplets in a big circular arc of 7 colours that spreads its way out before us in the sky. And because each individual water droplet acts like a tiny prism to disperse the light and reflect it back to an individual eye, there must be water droplets in front of you to see a rainbow. And apparently the sun must also be less than 42 degrees to have in the sky to have that visibility. So please know this. When God does put his rainbow in the sky, he puts it there in a very precise way so that each individual must uniquely interact with it to see it. This rainbow, his pure white light in all its beauty, his covenant reminder, God does not want you to miss it. And once God makes this covenant clear to these 4 men, verses 14 to 16 then tell us the purpose of this covenant. Whenever I bring my clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on earth. Can I tell you, children of God, this really is an everlasting covenant. Not only in regard to the sign of this covenant, which is the rainbow, but the fact that throughout the Bible, we see an entire thread of covenants that God makes with his people. God reaches out to his people again and again and again to demonstrate his everlasting love and faithfulness to us. The Hebrew word for this type of covenant love is hesed. And let's take a quick look at God's covenant love. We know that because God is an everlasting love, a God of everlasting love, the final covenant that God makes in his master plan is an everlasting covenant. Revelation refers to this. We also know that from Jeremiah 31 and Galatians 3:23 to 29, there's another covenant that actually replaces the old covenant, we're told. And it's available to everybody through faith in Jesus Christ, who forgives all sin, because this is a superior covenant, and it was established through the sacrifice of Jesus, who now becomes the Saviour of the world, the great high priest, King of kings, Lord of lords. And the sign of this covenant is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who makes a way for your eternal inheritance with God. With this new covenant, or Brit Chadasha, the law is now written on believers' hearts, and salvation comes through faith in Jesus. So if this covenant replaces an old one, we need to look back and see what the old covenant was. We know that God still demonstrated his faithfulness to his people before Jesus came along. So perhaps there was another covenant he used to do this. Is there something that points to this new covenant with Jesus? And the answer is yes. The Davidic covenant clearly points to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. In Samuel 2:7, verses 8 to 16, God promised that he would make David's name great. He would provide a place for his people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own. And the Lord would give them rest from their enemies. The Lord would establish David's house and would raise up David's offspring to succeed him and establish his kingdom. It is this person that will build a house in the Lord's name, and the Lord will establish his kingdom forever. So this covenant made by God tells us a king would come from the line of David and rule on the throne forever. He would be punished by the floggings of men, but God's love would never be taken away from him. David's house and kingdom would endure forever, and his throne would be established forever. And I'm sure that every single one of you here today is grateful to God for this covenant God made with David on behalf of his people Israel. I wonder though, was there another way that God showed his faithfulness and his commitment before the time of the Davidic covenant? After all, up to this time, we know that Israel repeatedly disobeyed God, and each time they were oppressed by foreign enemies. God would raise up a judge to call the Israelites to repentance and thus their deliverance. This was a really tumultuous time, known as the time of the judges, and ultimately the Israelites demanded a king and a God, and then in his own time and love, because he was still showing his covenant faithfulness and hesed love to his people, despite their unfaithfulness to the covenant, he established the Davidic covenant. We do discover God indeed confirms his everlasting covenant and commitment to his people, when he also establishes another covenant before this, known as Brit Kahuna, a perpetual priesthood covenant, as Numbers 25 verse 13 says, with Aaron and his male descendants. This covenant's mentioned in the Old Testament, in Exodus and Numbers, and it's a permanent statute, Exodus 29 verse 9 tells us, which granted Aaron and his descendants the exclusive right to serve in the tabernacle and later in the temple of Jerusalem, offering sacrifices and performing other sacred duties. God used this covenant to establish the structure for ancient Israel's sacrificial and worship system, and to ensure a line of priests would act between God and his people, which ultimately points us to Jesus. The sign of this covenant, then, is really the Aaronic priesthood, and it was an everlasting covenant to continue through Aaron's lineage as long as the heavens endure. However, this Aaronic covenant was actually an integral part of yet another covenant that was made by God before it. You might recall that God, in his love, makes another covenant with Israel through Moses, and this is known as the Mosaic covenant. It's from here where we get the Ten Commandments, and therefore the law. This particular covenant defined the terms of God's relationship with the Israelites. And the sign of that covenant was the Exodus. In Deuteronomy 3, verses 3 to 6, we see God's covenant that reiterates the promise of the land to Israel, however, with conditions. If the Israelites were obedient, they'd be blessed. If they were disobedient regarding God's instructions and covenant, this would lead to curses, including scattering. However, there would also be a future restoration to the land, because God is a God of great love, mercy, and faithfulness to his own commitment and covenant. And we see this restoration not because of anything that the Israelites will do, but because of God's great covenant love for them. And still today, God is watching over them and bringing the Jews back home to the land of Israel. Of course, we knew this, that God had brought the Israelite people up out of Egypt after they'd been enslaved there for 430 years. I wonder then, was there any covenant commitment by God of his faithfulness to his people before this? And again, we can conclusively say yes. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, we see God make another covenant with Abraham. And in Genesis 17, we see the sign of that covenant is circumcision. With this covenant, God promises to make Abram into a great nation. He will bless him, make his name great, and he'll be a blessing. God says he will bless those that bless Abram and curse those that curse him, and all peoples on earth will be blessed by him. We also see Abraham's wife, Sarai, or Sarah, now becoming the mother of nations. And God says kings of peoples will come from her. In the making of this covenant, God blesses Abraham's sons, both Isaac and Ishmael, to be fruitful and greatly increase in numbers. Note the mandate has not changed despite man's unfaithfulness. But God clearly states this covenant he was about to establish was with Isaac. Yet, how do we know that this covenant is going to be upheld by God? We can be assured of this because in Genesis chapter 15, verses 17, we see a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch pass between the pieces of cut animal sacrifice, which is God himself passing through as God made his commitment to the covenant. And at that time, God gave the land to Abraham and his descendants through Isaac as his inheritance. Now, this is starting to sound a bit familiar, right, considering what we've covered earlier. And the reason for that is that this is the very covenant that was made after God made his covenant with Noah, his sons and all living creatures, his everlasting covenant of the rainbow. Church, God loves us with a hesed love, or his covenantal love. We can see this clearly throughout the time and the pages of history. Yes, we see him showing his hesed, unwavering commitment and faithfulness to those that he calls his own. And he never, ever, ever lets go. In his faithfulness and commitment, he continually reminds us of the covenant that he has with us. This covenantal thread, we have seen it throughout the entire Bible. It is found in both the New Testament and in the Old Testament. And this, of course, brings us back to the everlasting covenant that I'm sharing about today from Genesis chapter 9, God's covenant rainbow. And we are nearly done. Earlier, I explained to you about the complex and precise way that a rainbow is created. With that being the case, when understanding God's master plan of covenant love, which we've just fast forwarded through from the end of time back to where we are now so that we can see the fullness of his plan, we need to try and understand what God's covenant truly means to the four men concerned at that time, and indeed to you as his descendants today. For my final point, I would like to consider then why God chose the sign of the rainbow as an everlasting covenant for this all to come together. The Hebrew word for rainbow is keshet, and this means war bow or bow. In Hebrew thought, an archer can send forth something with great power and accuracy. And Torah comes from the Hebrew word yara, which means to throw or shoot. 1 Samuel 20 verses 36 to 37 tells us it can mean to throw or shoot arrows. Yara can also mean to teach, and we find this in the Psalms and also in the book of Micah. And I know as a Christian, I often pray God's word does not return void, but will go forth and achieve the purpose for which it is sent, because his word is sent forth with great power and complete accuracy. So in the context of Genesis chapter 9, the men likely would have seen this rainbow as God putting away his war bow, as a sign of him never again destroying the earth with flood. In the moment of making that covenant, God, in his mercy and in an effort to teach these four men that he has a hesed, covenantal love for them and for their descendants, turned his war bow away from the earth. And to understand the significance of this, we need to think back to Genesis 1 verse 2. Remember, God separated the waters from the waters, and in Genesis 1 verse 6, he also created a firmament that's holding back the waters above the sky. Remember, the floodgates of heaven have been closed. At any moment in time, if God wished to, he could open the floodgates of heaven by piercing that firmament with his war bow and arrow, the power of his word. And all humanity would be destroyed in another flood. Yet in his great mercy, he covenanted to save all the living on earth by not bringing another flood on earth that would destroy everything. Ever since that day when God covenanted with Noah, Shem, Ham, and Yepet, so you as the descendants have multiplied and spread out across the earth. And we now get to see the evidence of his light, that covenant rainbow. Whenever God decides that you need a reminder that he will not destroy you by flood. Instead, because of his hesed covenant love for humanity, through the gift of grace of Christ Jesus, Lord of grace, and because of his everlasting covenant, he will redeem all humanity who believe in him unto himself.